Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a well known and respected professional from the world of technology, finance, and also who is a published author from San Francisco, USA, Mr. Vijay Rajendra. Vijay, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Ashutosh. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. Vijay is an investor of GAI Ventures. He's an author of a book titled The Funding Framework, Decoding Startup Fundraising. So, Vijay, before we start talking about GAI Ventures and your book, a few questions for you. You worn many hats as a consultant, founder, venture capitalist, and a coach. How would you describe the thread that connects all these roles?
Yeah. Throughout my career, I'm someone who has been of service to entrepreneurial leaders or a founder of new businesses myself.
Mm-hmm.
And that I think is a consistent thread throughout all the things that I try to do and what creates and gives me new energy to do more.
Okay. And having worked with startups across more than 80 countries, what cultural or leadership patterns have most surprised or inspired you?
I think the biggest surprise for me is what an extraordinary difference leadership makes. And it's not just in that it is an important input, which we can all assume, but I've come to realize that more than capital, more than technology, more than all these things that we think are very high leverage for institutions, communities, companies,
Mhm.
leadership and how leaders show up is much more important than any of the other inputs.
Right.
And I think that is really significant because it turns out, is something that can be developed. And in some cases, it can even become a renewable resource. We will not run out of it. It may become scarce, but we can develop, grow, and nurture more of it. And that's a connection I see between the different things I've done, seen, and experienced, and the opportunity for better leadership. And in my little corner of the world, that happens to be at the helm of startups, fast-growing businesses that are trying to make a big difference in their markets or in the world.
Well said. And what are the biggest lessons you have learned about building something new inside and outside large organizations?
In and out of large organizations, there's really different types of friction. So
Yeah.
in the case of a large organization, there is internal friction to doing new things in new ways. A large organization is there to do the same thing over and over again. That's what creates scale. That's what creates, advance up the experience curve and how we learn. And it's a bit like when you think about a great surgeon, a great brain surgeon doesn't walk into the hospital tomorrow and say, I think I'd really like to fix someone's arm today. Nope, they do the same brain surgery or various types of brain surgery again and again. And that's where they develop expertise. Alternatively, you have a startup that is facing a different type of challenge. And that isn't about the friction of trying to do new things. It is actually the challenge of managing with few resources or without a well-known brand, or potentially within a category that is new and emerging and requires sometimes customer education. But what that startup needs to do is to create pull in the market. It needs to find a path to distribution. It needs to figure out how it can tap into latent demand and emerge as a much bigger company and reach almost unreasonable levels of scale that most other people couldn't imagine, because if they did, it would already be self-evident.
Well said. Let's now talk about your GAI Ventures. And my first question here is, you describe GAI Ventures as a venture builder rather than a typical VC firm. What does this distinction mean in practice? And give me an example if possible.
So a typical VC firm identifies a business that might have a product, it might even have early revenues or sales, and then set about trying to determine if it meets their criteria and their thesis for investment, and then looking at the risks, meeting the team, decides to make an investment so that the business gets to the next stage. At a venture builder like GAI Ventures, sometimes also referred to as Venture Studio, we work at the idea stage. And so we come in very, very early because of our background as operators and investors as well to support really dynamic individuals who have an idea, and we bring a lot of technical expertise to help them build that business, launch it very quickly, and tap into the pull in the market that we think is there within the verticals or sectors that we've identified. And in our case, that is financial services, commerce, and enterprise productivity.
Right.
The reason I like the term venture builder is because we don't passively participate. We don't say, oh, this is great, here's an office, we're incubating you, just sit over there, work on something, come by once a day and check in. We actively help build the product. We try and figure out what the go-to-market or GTM should look like. And so we think we're at our best when we're bringing people, product, and pipeline together to set businesses up for a path to be able to launch faster and with much less risk than a typical startup that doesn't have those advantages.
And how do you identify which traditional industries are the most ready for vertical AI transformation?
There's a continuum of different types of businesses and how much they are already digitizing and how suitable like AI is there to do things. So today we see certain things that have changed thanks to AI, and it's because it's a perhaps repetitive task. It could be that there's a set amount of answers, and so machine learning and then generative AI are able to already solve problems like customer service, right? There are other things that AI is good at, like sorting through unstructured data. There's a lot of that in certain industries. Financial services comes to mind. There are also problems that can be operations research or other aspects related to commerce or in particular e-commerce. And then also there's a role for agents. And agents are, of course, when we have computers acting on our behalf with a set of instructions and with some opportunity to, of course, go beyond those instructions and learn based on the data they're trained on. So agents have a role there as well. And then we think within the area of general like enterprise productivity, we are giving people amazing new tools. Like it wasn't that long ago, perhaps a few decades ago, when there would be someone who would work in an office whose job it was to type something up. And that would be a step of creating a document. Today, everybody has the world's best word processor in the palm of their hand or on their desk.
Yeah.
It is going to be that kind of step of making everybody capable of writing well, of being able to do it on the spot. And in the same way, in other types of work, we're going to see AI empower us to be far more productive than in the past. And so that's an area that I'm very encouraged by. I think some of the things that we do today, like spend hours responding to messages, looking for information, digging around for things, planning things that we could have assistants and agents, of course, help us with. And so these are things that we're already seeing pull for in the market, and there are already startups building.
Yeah.
And we're asking ourselves, what's the next version of that, so that we're not just doing easy things, but we're really getting into the workflows of specific industries and specific individuals and companies, so that we learn, we understand, and we build things that once they have it, they couldn't imagine life without it before. And that's a big part of our journey towards building and starting new businesses.
And what, in your view, are some of the biggest misconceptions founders or investors have about AI startups today?
Yeah, I think founders are the expectation that there's so much money in AI. You know, I think it's something like 80% of investments in Silicon Valley these days are AI related. That if you have an AI startup, there must be funding available. And I think what it means to be an AI startup today is to still have, you know, traction, because traction is the important ingredient or proof point in order to be successful. On the investor side, a misconception can be, if you get to a certain amount of sales, therefore you must have product market fit. If you get to a certain place, therefore the company can go from build into sell mode. And that's not necessarily the case. It may be that because of the pace of iteration and the low cost of developing new solutions, that you may be building and selling iteratively forever. There may not be this moment of product market fit, and only where you go from no product market place to some state of product market evolution and growth. And so I think that's going to be a big shift for investors who often define themselves as early stage, which is before there is fit with the market, and later stage where, oh, we just need to put more money and scale it. And so I think that's a big difference.
Very well said. Thank you. How do you see the relationship between AI, innovation, and economic inclusion? Can AI help narrow or widen global opportunity gaps?
Oh, that's a very important question, right? Because what will this do for our species? What can this mean for the human race? I think AI has a role in two ways. One is, as you said, creating new opportunities. The other thing has to do with solving some of the problems that are wealth destroying or removing economic opportunity. So one example of the latter would be some of the effects of climate change, which have affected many of the most vulnerable people in society, and many people in geographies that can be very susceptible. I think AI has some opportunities for us to find new solutions to reduce carbon footprints, and thereby mitigate some of the long-term effects of climate change, which can impact a lot of people. On the inclusion side, I think we're looking for answers for how AI can affect financial inclusion. I think that's one of the main ways. So today, I'll give you one example. If you are applying for a loan, an individual may look at your loan application, and based on their bias about your it can be related to sex, age, race, any number of different characters, education. We make certain assumptions and right, but we have risk models today, and we have guidelines and rules to try and create like fair lending, and still these things can happen. So we need to have AI that is trained to avoid the human bias of the people who develop these models, and be improving AI so that you can provide access to credit to people who haven't gotten it before. Sometimes I'll give you one example. So if you are applying for credit on a cell phone, and you apply for the same person applies on an Apple device versus an Android device, they are more likely to be approved on the Apple device than the Android device, because there's an assumption in some training data that people with an Apple device must have more income. They can afford the more relatively more expensive product. And maybe that is true 90% of the time, but there are false negatives there, because somewhere you are rejecting people who are perfectly creditworthy just because they might or you're offering them less opportunity and less credit or whatever because they applied with an Android. So These are the real world problems that technology has created, and we need technology to address them now.
Very interesting. Vijay, now let's talk about your book, The
Yes.
Funding Framework, Decoding Startup Fundraising. And I'm going to ask all my viewers and listeners to go and check out Vijay Rajendran's book. Your book talks about understanding actual investor dynamics. What do founders often misunderstand about how investors think?
That's a very important question. So the prevailing wisdom or assumptions can be that investors are dying to meet your startup. They just need to hear about your journey and how wonderful you are, and your inspiration and ideas, and hear about the cleverness of your product, and they're going to be sold. They want to invest. Perhaps what they don't realize is that investors are trying to achieve certain outcomes of their own. It may be related to their thesis, their strategy, their fund size, the maturity of the fund from which they are investing, if they are institutional investors, or the investor dynamic can be one where the investor is curious and just trying to learn, and maybe the person in the firm who has reached out to you does or does not have power and decision-making authority based on whether they're a partner or an associate, or and I'm not trying to generalize between them, but these are some of the different investor dynamics. The biggest thing that founders get wrong, though, is they tend to see themselves as being quizzed. And so in a meeting where the person asking all the questions has the power, they cede power to investors, who then grill them for 30 minutes and then pass and then say they're not interested. Now, asking a lot of questions is a sign of interest, but certainly in the investor dynamics, you need to respond to every question with a question. You need to ask what their process is like, ask where they are on their fund journey, ask, what are the recent investments that match their thesis the best? What is it that they liked about the company? How have they supported companies like yours? Which founders would they ask you to talk about their experience as portfolio companies? And so these are all things that you can tangibly do to change the dynamic from one where you are asking for a favor for this person to have some of your time and hear about your business, to one where you are their peer and you are doing them a favor in many ways by letting them hear about what you're building and why it's so special.
Flipping through your book and looking at some of the reviews, and I was wondering, you talk of a particular phrase called a strategic fundraising process.
Yes.
Can you explain why it is essential?
Yes. So it is possible to start fundraising and having meetings and creating materials and going around. But if you have no deadline for anything in life, it can drag on forever. And so by creating a very tight process, you have steps that you want to achieve. You can work backwards from where you are to where you need to be now. And therefore, what is possible is then you can run a very tight process for a couple weeks to just have initial meetings or set up initial meetings, then run 2 or 3 weeks of those meetings, and then find a lead, and then wrap up with people who said they were interested, go through a tight due diligence process. And it is possible in 8 to 12 weeks to run through all of this. Sometimes it can become really fast, and if people are excited about the traction you have, they could decide very quickly and wire. But assume those edge cases are not the norm. And you need to give yourself time in order to raise and work backwards from the goal and run this type of process, as I described in the book, to be able to raise successfully.
Fascinating. Many founders fear fundraising. What mindset shifts do you recommend to turn that fear into confidence?
Yes, it is scary. The good news is that, much like something else, be it hiring or sales, this is something that you can learn. No one is born knowing how to fundraise. Maybe some people are born with great connections or something like that, and that is a complete accident. But the rest of it is and has to be learned. And the good news is that this is just something that you can get practice with. And I think the mindset does come down to, you are are worthy of investors' time and attention. What you're doing matters, and the right people will get behind what you're doing. If someone doesn't get it, they're not interested in your space, it's okay, move on, right?
Yeah.
Trying to convince someone of something they already ardently believe really matters. So, for example, if I were to declare that I don't understand cryptocurrency or something like that, and you're trying to pitch me on your crypto business, like, you're not going to convince me, and you're wasting your time. I'm not the right person for you, but there is someone out there who does. So your job, and it's particularly true of angel investors, is to find the person in the world who already believes in the future you're trying to create, because they are waiting for you to walk into their life and to be your partner, your capital provider in many ways, to achieve that outcome.
Fascinating. You also mentioned that learning what investors talk about behind closed doors is important to understand. Could you share an example of feedback founders rarely get directly?
Yeah. So throughout the book, there are stories collected from actual founders that I have coached or worked with, or might have been in our portfolio before, or that sort of thing. And so these stories are all changed to in some ways to of course change the names of the people and their specific circumstances. But in addition to their individual experiences, I also have a number of direct quotes from these investors. So some of the things that investors talk about over closed doors and they were willing to share in the book can be, not enough founders confidently ask the investors, what can you do for me beyond capital? How will you go to work for my business? Or asking, or things where they have a super technical founder and they have someone on their team who explains the numbers, and not knowing your numbers cold, and not in the sense that the figures and the projections that are relevant for the business shows that you aren't either familiar or confident enough to talk about them, and that's a yellow or even a red flag. So that's really important for people to see, and for that to be reflected in the experience where this person is trying to get to know you across the table, and why I see fundraising as fundamentally a trust building exercise.
I have time for two more questions for you, Vijay. Term sheets and cap tables can be intimidating for a founder. What are the top two things every founder must know before signing anything?
So there's a number of things that go into a cap table, but if I can cheat a little and say there are three things, right? All finance comes down to value, risk, and control.
Yeah.
So what is the value being discussed about the business, and do you understand whether it's there's a discount in the note, or an interest rate that's promised, or perhaps a future conversion rate that's in there? Like what matters when it comes to a risk perspective? What are what are some of the things that are being mitigated by the investor? And then from a control perspective, and so risk might be liquidation preferences and things like that. And then from a control perspective, are there board seats? Are there provisions where the company the firm investing may ask for right of first refusal, or right of first offer, even in the case of downstream fundraising? So these are aspects of value, risk, and control that you need to be able to tease out. And there are some examples certainly in the book to that point.
And my last question for you, what role does storytelling play in securing an investment?
So there are four parts of the funding framework, and the first one is storytelling, because before people know and believe in your company, they need to believe in you and the future you're trying to create. And so if you can create a powerful, memorable story about the hero's journey with a user or a person that you're helping and trying to solve for at the center, they want to know how that story ends. And you have their attention, and you become memorable, because the point of the first pitch is to get a next meeting. And at the end of the day, end of the week, people are going to sit back and they're like, of all the conversations I had, the one with Ashutosh was amazing because he told me this like story I can't get out of my head. You want to get in people's head, and how can you do that without a persuasive story?
And on that note, Vijay, I just want to say thank you so much for speaking to me. We had a very interesting conversation about GAI ventures. There's so much in AI that is being talked about, and so little people seem to know about the real impact AI could have potentially on their businesses and on themselves. Thank you also for speaking to me about your book, The Funding Framework. Funding is always a mystery for most startup founders, and I'm sure after reading your book, there will be a better understanding a lot of founders would have about this crazy thing that is called funding. Thank you again for speaking to me, and good luck to you.
What a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to The Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for The Brand Called You.